In the winter of 1899, the railway cut across the veldt like a wound of steel, a straight line of iron ambition bisecting land claimed by no one and fought over by everyone. Supply convoys clattered north under gray skies, each one a fragile artery feeding the front. The Imperial Corps called it the Iron Frontier. To the men stationed along it, it was merely the place where noise could kill. Lieutenant Elias Mercer stood beside the siding at dawn, notebook in hand, listening rather than looking. He was an engineer by rank, a mechanic by instinct, and, to most officers, a curiosity. Mixed blood, colonial-born, trained in the Empire's schools but never quite belonging to them. His duty was to keep the armored trains running, yet lately his attention had fixed on what made them die. Steam hissed through cracked valves, a heavy breathing of machines under strain. The night's frost still clung to the rails, making them gleam under the rising sun. Telegraph wires hummed faintly above, carrying coded reports eastward, fragments of a war stretched too thin. Mercer noted how every sound seemed amplified in this emptiness. Pistons knocking, couplers slamming, smoke ejecting in rhythmic bursts. Even from miles away, a listener could map their passage by sound alone. Too loud, he murmured to himself, adjusting his spectacles as another train rumbled past, its armor plates rattling like chains. He'd measured it once, timing the echoes along the cuttings. The enemy didn't need eyes, they had ears in the hills. Bore spotters, the reports said, using nothing but stethoscopes pressed into the ground to track the train's approach. He wrote in his logbook, "Sound travels faster through steel than air. The line betrays us before the men do." The commanding officer had no patience for this. "You're an engineer, Mercer, not a philosopher. Fix the wheels, not the world." But Mercer's mind refused to stop mapping patterns. Each attack, each derailment followed the same rhythm, a delay between the first whistle and the shells falling. As if someone out there could hear them long before sight confirmed what was coming. By mid-morning, the yard was alive with routine. Crews hammered at wheel flanges, checked couplings, and replenished the coal bunkers. A thin line of smoke rose from the locomotives at idle, drifting into the wind. Mercer moved among them, attentive to details others ignored. How grease dampened the sound of a bearing, how worn rivets amplified vibration through the chassis. Every hiss and knock was a code, telling him where silence might be found if one knew how to listen. A telegraph operator jogged by, tapping a message strip. "Boers hit the east convoy," he said, breathless. Mercer glanced up. The east line ran 20 miles ahead, along an exposed embankment that curved toward the hills. The same route scheduled for the next armored run at dawn. The sky darkened with distant smoke. Seconds later, the sound reached them, a low, rolling concussion that traveled through the rails before it hit the air. Men froze, hands halfway to their rifles, listening to that deep iron groan. The telegraph wires trembled above them. Mercer closed his notebook slowly. The rails beneath his boots were still humming, carrying echoes of impact long before the news reached command. He looked eastward, where the line vanished into fog and fire, and spoke quietly, as if dictating to an invisible recorder. "They didn't see us coming," he said. "They heard us." The sentence lingered, half swallowed by the wind, and the rhythmic clatter of retreating echoes the sound of a frontier learning, too late, that steel could speak. Then, across the plain, another explosion bloomed, nearer this time, and before the dawn whistle of the next train. The Iron Frontier had answered back. Field Report, Section 4B. Initial observations of mechanical sound and enemy response. Classified, 1899. The workshop smelled of oil, coal dust, and graphite, a metallic incense of war and invention. Lieutenant Elias Mercer had long since stopped hearing the human noises around him. The chatter of mechanics, the cough of boilers, the rasp of steel files. What reached him now were only the vibrations beneath those sounds, the ghost pulse of the war itself, thrumming through the rails. He had commandeered a side table near the telegraph station, converting it into a crude laboratory. Spread before him lay a collection of scavenged instruments, tin funnels, lengths of copper tubing, and strips of lead pressed flat. A field stethoscope, its tubing patched with wax, hung around his neck. Graphite powder clung to his fingers, staining the edges of his logbook. Each tool served one purpose. To make the invisible tremor of sound visible, measurable, he began with the simplest test. Placing a narrow pane of glass over a short section of track, he scattered graphite dust across it. Then, gently, he struck the rail with a wrench. The particles quivered into motion, forming symmetrical ripples that radiated from the point of impact. He noted the pattern: wave peaks spaced evenly, their rhythm echoing the pulse of the metal itself. Sound, he wrote, does not travel through air alone. The ground is its truer ally. Steam locomotives, he realized, betrayed themselves not by their plume or whistle, but by the frequency of their wheels against the track. A certain pitch, a certain rhythm, announced their weight long before they appeared. A good listener, or an enemy scout with a steel rod to the earth, could read it like Morse code. The night outside was calm, the veldt quiet except for a low wind and the hiss of cooling engines. Mercer set the stethoscope against the track, the earpiece pressed close. The hum that reached him was deep, resonant, like breath drawn through a great organ pipe. Distant movement. He checked the timetable. No scheduled trains within 10 miles. He marked the oscillation interval. Every 4 seconds, a slight tremor. 2 locomotives, by his estimate, heavy freight or armored carriages. They were moving north, the wrong direction. He straightened, looking toward the dark horizon. The enemy had learned faster than command believed. By dawn, Mercer's bench was littered with sketches, pencil tracings of waveforms, notes on vibration amplitude, comparative timings between different track compositions. He had even managed to record how sound carried differently across ballast stone versus open iron. His report draft began with a blunt thesis. If we can hear them, they can hear us. The rails are not transport, they are telegraph lines of sound. When he brought it to the command post, the reception was colder than the veldt morning. Colonel Faversham scanned a few lines before setting the paper down. "You're suggesting we fight silence with silence?" he asked, his tone amused. "That we mute the trains?" Mercer said nothing. He knew the colonel hadn't read past the first paragraph. Faversham sighed and flipped the report closed. "The war is fought with guns, not ghosts, Lieutenant. Leave acoustics to the physicists." He gestured toward a clerk who dutifully filed the notes away. Confiscated, archived, forgotten. Mercer returned to his quarters without protest, though the rhythmic hum beneath the floorboards seemed louder now. He sat by the window, listening to the rails outside. Even when no train passed, the iron whispered faintly, a constant vibration underfoot. It reminded him of a heartbeat, the railway itself alive, carrying messages none could see. Then, in the stillness, a distinct pulse rose through the floor. Not random, not ambient. A steady, mechanical thrum, deeper than before. He pressed the stethoscope to the wall, tracing the resonance downward, to the rails beneath the compound. The pattern was unmistakable: dual pistons, uneven traction, advancing rapidly. There was no train scheduled on the line that night. Mercer froze, counting the rhythm of the vibration as it grew stronger. Somewhere beyond the dark ridge, an engine was moving, unseen, unheard by anyone else, yet echoing through the ground like a warning. He whispered to himself, voice barely audible over the pulse of metal. "They're listening back." Field Report, Section 5C. Preliminary Study on Sound Transmission via Rail. Suppressed by Order of Command, 1900. The field logs for that night list no scheduled movement, no test drills, and no mechanical trials, yet the rail line outside Blockhouse 19 bore fresh wheel marks by dawn. The men stationed there spoke of a ghost train that rolled through the dark without whistle or clatter, as if the earth itself had held its breath to let it pass. In the suppressed engineering notes later recovered from Lieutenant Elias Mercer's quarters, the explanation begins clinically, almost without emotion, objective, to reduce locomotive acoustic signature during transit over open plains. Method: suspension modification using rubberized padding from carriage stock, lubrication of coupling rods and piston slides to dampen percussive resonance, fabric insulation on housing to absorb metal-on-metal vibration. He had requisitioned the parts quietly: spare rubber seals from water barrels, cuttings from worn upholstery, and strips of canvas once used to cover munitions crates. Piece by piece, under lamplight and the scent of machine grease, Mercer and 2 trusted men reassembled the undercarriage of a Class D steam locomotive. They worked in silence. Even their tools were wrapped in cloth to prevent clinking. The locomotive ironclad number 14 stood half disassembled in the shed like some gutted mechanical beast. Mercer's hands were black with soot and graphite dust as he inserted the final rubber mountings beneath the drive rod assemblies. The texture was uneven, the fit improvised, but the principle sound. When he finally gave the signal, the fireman lit the boiler with half charge, just enough to move the engine 10 miles down and back. The goal was not distance, but silence. Mercer recorded the data as the locomotive crept forward, standard decibel estimate, 84 dB at 20 feet. Modified reading, approximately 49. The difference was astonishing. The usual symphony of warm metal, the rhythmic clash of pistons, the iron clang of couplers, the echoing percussion that rolled across the veldt, was gone. What remained was only a low hum, a breath of steam diffused beneath the hiss of wind. From a distance, it sounded like nothing at all. The train advanced into the night, its shadow slipping between telegraph poles like smoke. The crew moved with the caution of thieves, whispering even though no one could hear them. Steam vented softly, muffled beneath a layered shroud of canvas tied over the funnel stack. The rails glimmered faintly, slick with dew. To Mercer, it was perfection, a triumph of silence. For the first time, the train no longer betrayed itself. But in the black expanse beyond the ridge, a sentry on night watch glimpsed the dark silhouette gliding across the plain, unlit, soundless, advancing along the main line. He raised his rifle and signaled with his lantern. No response. No whistle, no light, no sound. Panic took root faster than thought. To a guard conditioned by weeks of enemy raids, a train that made no noise could only be theirs. The first shot cracked the night like a whip. Inside the cab, Mercer ducked instinctively as the bullet punched through the canvas shroud above the boiler. The firemen throttled back, heart hammering. "They're firing on us." "Lights," Mercer ordered calmly, voice even. "Now." The engineer swung open the furnace hatch, spilling orange glow across the night. Steam poured from the release valve in a great white plume, a deliberate signature. Within moments, the gunfire ceased. By the time the patrol arrived, the locomotive stood still, hissing gently under the pale wash of the moon. Mercer handed over his identification with the steadiness of a man who had already prepared his defense. No report was filed that night, though whispers spread through the camp by morning. A ghost train ran the line and lived. Mercer returned to his bunk and opened his notebook. His handwriting remained measured, detached. Result: successful reduction in audible detection range. Secondary risk: misidentification as hostile. Recommendation: controlled deployment under supervision. But even as he wrote, he knew command would never approve it. They would fear what they could not hear. At dawn, he was summoned to the colonel's tent. The first question came cold and direct. "Lieutenant," Faversham said, "would you care to explain why my night guards nearly opened fire on a phantom locomotive?" Mercer said nothing, only stared at the colonel, the faint scent of coal smoke still clinging to his uniform. Filed under Unauthorized Field Experiment Number 3. Recovered from Imperial Records, 1900. Extract from Colonial Command Hearing Number 47B. Conducted at Fort Apsley, 3rd Regiment of Armored Transport, June 1899. Time: 6 o'clock hours. Location: Command Operations Tent, Perimeter Rail Junction. Subject: unauthorized mechanical modification of state property, Class D locomotive. Officers present: Colonel Faversham, Chair; Captain Lyle, Recorder; Lieutenant Greaves, Observer. Accused: Lieutenant Elias Mercer, Engineering Corps. Faversham: you'll understand, Lieutenant, that what you did constitutes direct interference with wartime material. A locomotive is not a laboratory. Mercer: with respect, sir, it was a laboratory. It's how progress begins, through alteration. Lyle: you admit, then, to unauthorized modifications? Mercer: I admit to experimentation, sir. The results speak for themselves. Reduced vibration, lower detection range. Had the guard not panicked? Faversham: interrupting, had the guard not panicked, Lieutenant, we'd have a rogue engine somewhere on Her Majesty's lines, cloaked in silence and liable to draw friendly fire at every post. Pause. The sound of papers shuffling. The tent canvas strains in the wind. Lyle: the men are calling it the ghost train. You understand the difficulty this presents for morale? Mercer, morale would improve. Captain, if our machines stopped announcing their position to every enemy artilleryman within 5 miles. The record notes murmurs from the assembled officers. Faversham, you're not in a position to teach us tactics, Lieutenant. Your duty was maintenance, not reinvention. Mercer, innovation was the instruction I was given when assigned to the Corps, sir. Efficiency is the engine of survival. Lyle, efficiency, yes, but not at the expense of regulation. You commandeered padding from civilian stores, used rations of grease reserved for artillery pieces, and wrapped the engine stack in canvas without clearance. That's not efficiency. That's insubordination disguised as ingenuity. Minutes note, subject shows composure, no visible remorse. Faversham, tell me, Lieutenant, where did you learn these acoustic principles? Mercer, from observation. The rails speak, sir. Every vibration, every tremor along the iron gives away a position. I was studying how to quiet that voice. Lyle, dryly the rails speak. Mercer, to those who listen. Brief silence recorded, followed by the sound of a match being struck. The colonel lights a cigarette. Faversham, the army has no interest in poets, Lieutenant. Greaves, with respect, sir, if I may. Faversham, go on. Greaves, I've reviewed Mercer's schematics. The data's sound. No pun intended. The technique could have applications for supply trains near the front, if properly supervised. Faversham, if properly supervised. Exhale smoke. So what would you have us do? Decorate him for breaking protocol? Greaves, no, sir. I'd have him put where his methods might do some use, under direct field command. Faversham, after a pause, you mean to send him forward? Greaves, precisely. He can tinker all he likes when shells are falling around him. If his silence is so valuable, let him prove it on the line. The colonel's chair scrapes against the boards. Papers rustle. The record indicates the decision was unanimous. Ruling, Lieutenant Elias Mercer is hereby relieved of laboratory privileges and reassigned as Field Engineer, Front Rail Division, Northern Line. All research materials pertaining to locomotive modification are to be sealed under Section 12B of the Imperial Engineering Code. Innovations of uncertain tactical benefit. Further discussion of the silent train project is prohibited. Outside, the fog hung low over the parade ground, muting the clatter of boots and distant signals. Mercer emerged from the tent with his orders folded in his coat pocket, his face expressionless. The camp still smelled faintly of coal smoke and cold coffee. Beyond the horizon, he saw a faint smear of darkness rising against the pale dawn, not cloud, but smoke. Thick, oily, and moving along the main rail route. Enemy locomotives, he thought. They were coming, and they'd hear him long before he ever saw them. Filed under. Command Proceedings, Restricted Archive C/1899, Subject Mercer, E. The Silent Track. Extract from Field Log, Northern Rail Division, Front Sector, July 1899. Compiled from after-action reports and surviving telegraph transcripts. The first thing Mercer saw when he reached the front was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the aftermath of machinery stripped of purpose. The rails lay torn and twisted across the veldt like broken ribs, half buried in mud. One locomotive lay on its side, its steel wheels still ticking faintly as they cooled, the sound like a dying heartbeat. A gutted supply wagon burned 100 yards down the embankment, throwing off smoke that drifted low and sluggish in the rain. The front had moved faster than the railway could heal. Mercer walked the length of the wreck, his boots sinking into the charred ballast. Everywhere, there were signs of sabotage, bolts removed, sleepers split by hand tools, signaling wires cut clean through. Someone had known exactly where to strike. The damage was surgical, the kind only insiders or students of rail could have inflicted. 3 trains lost in 2 nights, a sergeant reported, his voice hollow. They hit the same stretch every time. Mine's under the 3rd tie. You can see the pattern if you know where to look. Mercer did look. He crouched by the rails, rain dripping from his cap, fingers tracing the torn metal. The pattern was unmistakable. Timing, precision, sound. Whoever was laying the traps was listening, just as he had. By dusk, the station was a graveyard. Carriages half submerged in mud, horses scavenging spilled grain from ruptured barrels, the telegraph house blackened by fire. The operators worked from a single surviving line, messages tapping weakly through the static of the storm. Every coded burst came with a delay, seconds that, in this war, meant lives. Mercer stood under the shattered roof of the engine shed, studying his new command. 6 men, 2 operable locomotives, and not enough spare parts to build a child's toy. The men refused to move after sunset. The enemy ambushed by sound, they said. Scouts placed their ears to the rails at night. Hearing the iron song of oncoming trains long before sight gave them away. Mercer understood that better than anyone. The irony burned him. His silent train, the machine that could have passed unseen, unheard, had been buried under orders and reprimands. Now, the front paid the price in blood and twisted steel. He leaned over the map pinned to the wall, the ink blurred by moisture. The supply lines bent like arteries through the veldt, narrow and exposed. At least one bridge north of Mulder's Creek was gone. Every detour meant risk. He wrote quick notes in the margin: rubber pads, piston covers, low-pressure release. Improvisations that could be built in the field. The silence could still be made. The trains could still move unseen. But he had no authority. When he sent a proposal to command, a brief, practical memorandum titled Noise Suppression and Nocturnal Operation, it came back stamped in red, denied. Unauthorized alteration of standard equipment strictly prohibited. He folded the paper once and tucked it into his coat. Outside, the wind picked up. Rain hissed over the wreckage, drumming faintly on the corrugated roof. A lantern flickered at the telegraph post. The operator inside was tapping frantically, the line hissing with static. Mercer crossed to the doorway, wiping rain from his eyes. The operator looked up, pale and exhausted. "New orders, sir. Direct from command." He handed over the damp telegram. The words bled slightly where the ink had run. Urgent. Supply convoy 42 must cross enemy territory tonight. No delay permitted. All engineers to prepare line under cover of darkness. Mercer read the message twice. Then once more, slower. He folded it back along its crease. Outside, thunder rolled along the horizon, echoing through the broken rails. Somewhere out there, in the soaked darkness, the enemy listened, their ears pressed to the iron. The line was broken, but not dead. And Mercer knew, before the night was through, someone would have to move through that silence. Filed under. Incident report. Night Convoy 42. Preliminary conditions. Outcome pending. Extract reconstructed from field engineering notes. Recovered in the ruins of the Mulder's Creek Depot, 1903. Mercer began before midnight, working by the tremor of a lantern that swung faintly in the fog. Around him, the rail yard stretched like a cathedral of iron and shadow, half-dismantled carriages, forgotten freight, the glimmer of rain collecting in oil puddles. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured. The night was close, wet, and strangely intimate. The convoy stood waiting. One locomotive for supply wagons, and a tender half-full of low-grade coal. It would not move fast, but it had to move unheard. Mercer's tools were laid out with the order of a surgeon. Brushes, greased tins, strips of salvaged canvas, rubber padding from old carriage seats. He moved along the undercarriage, every motion deliberate, greasing bearings until they shone wetly in the lantern light, winding padding around piston housings until they no longer clanged when tapped. He whispered to the mechanic beside him, "If it rattles, it betrays us." The man nodded, though his face showed doubt. "Sir, if it's too silent, the crew won't know it's alive." "That's the point," Mercer said. "They shouldn't hear it. The enemy shouldn't either." By 1 o'clock, the locomotive was swathed in layers of oil and cloth. Steam lines were vented through mufflers made from discarded ration tins, their seams soldered shut with candle wax and lead shavings. Mercer adjusted the regulator valve, fine-tuning the exhaust pressure until the engine breathed in low, steady hisses rather than the usual sharp bursts. Each adjustment was a quiet act of defiance, against the manuals, against command, against the Empire's own arrogance. He timed every segment with his pocket watch, noting the pulse of the machine against the tick of brass gears. Every noise had to be mapped, minimized, understood. When the tender shuddered too loudly, he disassembled the linkage and lined it with greased hemp. When the piston rings clanged faintly, He replaced them with makeshift inserts from a cut section of boot leather. Improvisation became survival. The fog thickened as dawn neared. By the time the crew assembled, the world was nothing but vapor and faint silhouettes. Their breath mingled with the steam. Everything seemed part of the same slow exhale. Mercer gave final instructions in a whisper. Throttle slow. No whistles, no lights. Communicate only by touch. 1 tap means halt. 2 means proceed. The firemen hesitated. If they catch us, they won't hear us, Mercer interrupted. Not if we keep the line clean. He climbed into the cab, wiping grease from his hands. The gauge flickered, 60 pounds of pressure, just enough to move. The driver released the brake. The train shivered, almost reluctantly, then began to glide forward. There was no roar, no thunder of wheels. Only the muted rhythm of motion, like heartbeats under heavy cloth. Even the rails themselves seemed complicit, accepting the weight in silence. As they rolled into the open veldt, the fog absorbed everything: light, sound, shape. The engine's glow dimmed to a ghostly ember. Through the thin veil of mist, Mercer could just make out the telegraph poles drifting by like grave markers. He checked his watch again. Perfect timing. If they stayed on schedule, they would pass the enemy listening post before the moon broke the clouds. But war had a way of disobeying clocks. Half an hour into the run, a glimmer tore through the fog, a bright, brief streak that split the horizon. The flare rose silently, then burst into pallid fire, washing the rails in white. Shadows of the crew flashed across the carriages. Someone shouted from the rear wagon. Mercer's hand froze on the throttle. His mind caught between two truths. They might have been seen, or worse, heard. The light hung in the sky for a moment longer, then began to drift downward, slowly dying. In the unnatural silence that followed, the only sound was the faint ticking of his watch and the hiss of the muted engine. He didn't know if it meant discovery or salvation, only that the night had turned from ally to witness. And the silent track carried on, vanishing into the fog as if history itself had swallowed it whole. Filed as Test Run Report, Nocturnal Convoy 42. Observation incomplete. Outcome uncertain. Compiled from after-action accounts, telegraph intercepts, and fragmentary locomotive logs, 1900. The convoy moved like a ghost through a corridor of iron and fog. No whistle, no clatter, only the soft, breathing rhythm of pressure and motion, steam pulsing beneath canvas, gears turning in muffled synchrony. Lieutenant Elias Mercer stood by the cab window, his gloved hand resting on the regulator, every sense sharpened to vibration. The landscape around them was invisible, reduced to suggestion. A faint shimmer of rails, the pale bones of telegraph poles, the dull flash of artillery far to the east. Somewhere ahead lay the enemy's listening posts, men trained not to see trains, but to hear them. Mercer's notes had called this territory the auditory front. Tonight, it would be their proving ground. Each mile passed as a test of nerves. The crew spoke only through taps on the bulkhead. 1 for halt, 2 for proceed, 3 for trouble. The gauges trembled faintly, their needles reflecting the weak light of an oil lamp wrapped in cloth. The driver's breath came slow, controlled. The silence was so absolute it had texture, thick, oppressive, heavy enough to weigh on the lungs. Then came the first vibration. Not their own, but distant, faint metallic reverberations running through the rail bed. Mercer knelt and pressed a stethoscope, improvised from copper tubing, against the carriage floor. Through it, he could hear the pulse of another train. Heavy wheels, uneven load, somewhere beyond the ridge. He marked it mentally. Enemy logistics train, westbound. We are beneath their notice. Still, he signaled the driver, slow to half speed. Silence was protection, but restraint was survival. Hours stretched into fragments of eternity. They passed burned signal posts, the corpses of derailed carriages, and cut telegraph lines hanging limp like broken veins. At one crossing, Mercer dismounted briefly, his boots silent on the cinders, to inspect a stretch of track gleaming too brightly in the moonlight. Sabotage. The rails ahead had been loosened, one spike pulled clean out, another twisted to misalign the gauge. A single axle could have sent the entire convoy tumbling into the ravine. He signaled halt. The crew froze. For 10 minutes, Mercer worked wordlessly, hammering without impact by striking the spike through a leather glove, binding it in with grease-soaked cloth to absorb the sound. Each motion was a calculation. One noise too loud, one moment too long, and the mission would dissolve into fire. As he worked, a whisper of static trembled through the telegraph wire nearby. Faint, broken Morse signals, impossible to ignore. Someone was transmitting. The message repeated, clipped and confused. Train heard, not seen. Confirm visual. Mercer's blood cooled. They were being listened for. He finished tightening the final spike, rose slowly, and gave the signal to move. The locomotive stirred, gliding forward on its near-silent joints. Every second stretched thin. They crossed the ridge and began descending into the narrow valley that marked the edge of enemy patrol range. The air was colder here, the fog dense enough to blur the world into grayscale smears. From the cab, Mercer could make out the faint hum of telegraph wires above them, still carrying intermittent chatter. The enemy was guessing in the dark, chasing phantoms. Then light. A sharp, erratic sweep across the rail bed, no more than 30 yards ahead. A lantern, held by an unseen hand, cutting through the mist. Mercer froze. The fireman instinctively reached for the whistle lever, but Mercer's hand shot out, stopping him. The beam swept once, twice, closer. A sentry, perhaps drawn by the faint smell of coal or the vibration underfoot. Mercer doused the covered lamp with a twist of cloth. Total darkness consumed them. The engine coasted, silent as breath, wheels gliding on the thin edge between motion and stillness. The lantern paused, hovered, then turned away, its light swallowed again by fog. No one spoke. No one breathed. Mercer stared ahead, the pulse of his watch echoing louder than the train itself. They were through the lines, or almost. But now the silence felt different, no longer a weapon, but a secret shared with the dark. And in that fragile quiet, even victory seemed afraid to make a sound. Filed under. Convoy 42, Sector Cross-Transit Report. Result: unconfirmed passage. Status: concealed movement achieved. Possible detection pending. Compiled from soldier diaries, barracks reports, and intercepted field communications, 1900. The convoy rolled out of the fogged valley just before dawn, wheels whispering over the damp steel like a muted heartbeat. Mercer remained at the controls, sweat damp on his brow, eyes fixed on the horizon where the first streaks of sunlight would reveal whether the night had protected them or betrayed them. By the time they reached the relative safety of the forward supply depot, no shots had been fired, no flares raised, and no alarms sounded. Crews at the station stared at the silent locomotive in astonishment, whispering among themselves. The engine huffed softly, exhaling fogged steam into the chill morning air, seemingly more a wraith than a machine. Word of the miracle spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers who had been hunkered down along the listening posts told stories of a train heard but never seen, gliding through enemy lines with impossible stealth. Rumors compounded each retelling. Some swore it moved without wheels. Others claimed the rails themselves bent to silence its passage. Commanders at nearby posts circulated dispatches describing the phantom engine, attributing its passage to divine favor or sheer luck. Mercer, however, said nothing. He descended from the cab, wiping grease from his hands, and watched as the men celebrated around the wagons, unloading supplies in muted jubilation. Every soldier believed they had witnessed a miracle. Mercer knew it was the product of meticulous timing, mechanical ingenuity, and the obsessive pursuit of silence. Yet, even in this quiet triumph, complications arose. A rival officer, eager for recognition and ever attentive to unusual events, intercepted fragments of telegraph chatter and began claiming credit for the convoy's miraculous survival. Soon, whispers circulated of the engineer who built silence, though none suspected Mercer directly. Mercer continued his work in secrecy, returning to his modifications, testing new muffling methods, greasing pistons in ways that further reduced auditory footprint, and refining the suspension to make even the largest loads glide like shadows. His hand in the ghostly success remained concealed, known only to himself and the murmurs of the night. In the barracks, soldiers retold the story in hushed tones. Candlelight flickered against wooden walls, casting long shadows over soot-stained faces. It passed right through the enemy lines, one whispered. Not a sound, not a flicker of light. Laughter rippled softly, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mercer observed from a corner, noting every embellishment, every dramatization. Fact and legend were beginning to intertwine. Reports filtered up to intelligence officers in neighboring commands. Sketches were drawn, crude maps annotated with approximate routes, and telegrams speculating on the methods behind the ghost engine. Though the enemy could neither confirm nor understand the passage, the seeds of fascination were sown. Agents and reconnaissance units would soon fan out in search of the engineer who could render an armored train invisible to sound and sight. Mercer did not sleep that morning. He sat by the rails, adjusting minor tolerances on the undercarriage, adding padding to noisy rods, inspecting oil levels. Every small improvement felt like a secret ritual, a silent handshake between man and machine, a covenant with stealth. The soldiers continued to speak of miracles, while Mercer documented each step in a ledger, precise and detached, ensuring that history, if it ever reached it, would know the truth beneath the legend. And far away, in enemy territory, agents began gathering intelligence, combing reports, and questioning local sympathizers. Somewhere, someone was asking the first whispering question: who built the ghost train? The answer remained unknown. Filed as Convoy 42 Post-Mission Log. Status: complete. Anecdotal soldier reports suggest ghost phenomena. Engineer identity unconfirmed. Further observation recommended. The air was sharp and wet that morning, carrying the scent of iron and coal through the camp. Officers in gray uniforms paced in rigid lines, eyes scanning the tracks and telegraph poles as if the rails themselves might betray the engineer's secret. Interrogations had intensified. Clerks combed through maintenance logs. Foremen were questioned repeatedly, and every junior engineer's activities were cross-referenced against movement schedules. Lieutenant Elias Mercer moved among the shadows, careful to appear absorbed in routine checks, yet every footstep echoed like a potential alarm. In the dead of night, he had hidden his meticulously kept notes inside a hollow telegraph pole just beyond the supply yard, wedged so securely that only he knew their precise location. The pages contained detailed schematics of muffled bearings, greased pistons, and padded couplings, all evidence of his silent engineering. If discovered, these notes would mark him for immediate arrest, or worse. Rumors filtered back through the ranks. Soldiers whispered about the phantom engineer, and command speculated openly on who could have transformed a locomotive into a ghost. Tension thickened like fog over the tracks, clinging to uniforms, boots, and the cold steel of rails. Suspicion shifted frequently. Today, one engineer was scrutinized. Tomorrow, a conductor. The next, a section foreman. Every familiar face could be a betrayer. Mercer learned to study reactions as intently as he studied the train. A flicker of the eyes, a finger twitch, a hesitated answer in a report. Silence became both shield and weapon, a method of survival against a growing intelligence dragnet. Then a shock. Near the eastern rail yard, the body of the rival officer, the one who had publicly claimed credit for the ghostly convoy, was discovered. He lay crumpled near a maintenance shed, his uniform muddied, a faint red stain on his cuff. The camp erupted in chaos. Rumors ran rampant. Some whispered enemy action, others muttered of internal reprisals. Mercer noted each detail clinically, his detached mind cataloging the possibilities: accident, revenge, exposure. From his hidden vantage, he observed the investigator's frenzy. Telegraphed orders demanded strict accounting. Interrogate all engineers, search personal effects, seize documents. Patrols were doubled along the line, and sentries questioned anyone near maintenance areas. Even minor deviations in routine could trigger immediate detention. Mercer's pulse remained controlled, though the chill of fear crept along his spine. He understood now that the investigation had transformed from procedural inquiry into a hunt. The rival officer's death was a grim signal. The stakes were higher than ever. He returned to his cabin, moving methodically, ensuring every tool and ledger was accounted for, every misaligned piston restored to quiet perfection. Every movement was calculated, deliberate, silent, invisible. The fear of discovery was not abstract. It had become tangible, as real as the rails underfoot. And yet, for all the care, Mercer knew that the enemy's attention had shifted directly toward him. Surveillance intensified, whispers followed him, and every unguarded glance at the telegraph poles, every step in the yard, became a possible revelation. The hunt was no longer for a phantom. It was personal. Mercer pressed his hand against the hollow telegraph pole, feeling the paper beneath his palm. In that brief contact, he recognized the fragile line between safety and exposure. One wrong move, one misheard conversation, and the secret of the silent train would be uncovered. Outside, the wind rattled against the dormitory windows, carrying the sound of boots on wet cobblestones and distant hammers on steel. Somewhere nearby, the investigators would continue their search. Somewhere, the enemy would be listening. Mercer exhaled slowly. The hunt had begun in earnest. And he was the quarry. Filed under. Intelligence Bulletin. Ghost Locomotive Investigation. Status: escalated. Officer casualty noted. Primary suspect unidentified. Field operatives directed to expand surveillance and interrogations. Risk to concealed engineer: extreme. Compiled from field logs and post-action reports, 1900. The night was fractured by bursts of distant artillery, each explosion illuminating the fractured skyline in harsh white flashes against the blackened smoke of the battlefield. Timbered structures along the supply yards groaned under shellfire, and fractured telegraph poles hissed as sparks arced from snapped wires. The air was thick with rain, mud, and the metallic scent of overheated engines. Lieutenant Elias Mercer stood beside the battered locomotive, assessing the damage. The engine had been hit by shrapnel, one wheel axle slightly bent, pistons pitted, and coupling rods nicked. Yet, despite the odds, the mission was clear: evacuate the wounded across the contested line before the enemy could overrun the position entirely. This silent track, modifications, rubberized bearings, greased rods, padded undercarriages, would be tested under conditions far harsher than any previous attempt. Every minute counted. Telegraph lines were faltering under bombardment. Every moment lost meant lives at risk. Mercer moved with mechanical precision, adjusting pistons, tightening bolts, and lubricating joints while firelight flickered across the damp steel. Each adjustment was a silent prayer, a ritual performed under mortal threat. The wounded were loaded quickly, their groans muffled by blankets and the hiss of escaping steam. Crew members whispered to avoid drawing attention. The usual clatter of preparation had been replaced by a tense hush, broken only by the occasional distant boom of artillery. Mercer's eyes flicked to the horizon, where the fog hung heavy over the rails, a shroud to obscure their departure. At the signal, the engine lurched forward. Wheels rolled over the wet iron with barely a sound, a testament to the ingenuity of the silent track modifications. The rubberized suspension absorbed the vibrations, greased rods and canvas-covered pistons masked the typical metallic clamor. Mercer held the throttle with careful restraint, timing each segment of track to avoid detection from enemy listening posts or night patrols. Lightning briefly illuminated the battlefield, revealing fractured telegraph poles and burning wagons in stark silhouette. A shell burst near the railhead, sending mud and debris across the ties. Yet Mercer adjusted, diverting the engine with split-second precision. Rain sluiced over the crew's uniforms and the wet steel, adding to the night's oppressive weight. Minutes stretched into eternity. Each passing mile through artillery zones was a negotiation with fate. Mercer monitored the vibrations through the cab floorboards, listening for any indication that enemy scouts had detected them. The wounded lay quiet, trusting the unseen engineer to deliver them safely, oblivious to the subtle orchestration beneath their feet. Then, as the train entered the densest fog, the last telegraph station went dead. Sparks from snapped lines flickered into the mist, cutting communication entirely. Orders could no longer reach them. The line ahead was unverified. Silence enveloped the convoy, absolute except for the faint hiss of steam muffled beneath the padded pistons. Mercer exhaled once, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The engine, and everyone aboard, had vanished into the haze. Behind them, the rails stretched empty and quiet, indistinguishable from the desolate landscape battered by war. No reports came. No flashes from distant stations confirmed their passage. Only the whisper of rain on steel and the echo of artillery remained, leaving the night, and Mercer's fate, uncertain. In the annals of the front, the rails fell silent. Too silent. Filed under. Field evacuation report, line 7. Status, unknown. Engineer, unconfirmed. Wounded successfully loaded. Telegraph contact lost. No confirmation of arrival. Mission outcome pending. Reconstructed from post-action field reports, engineering logs, and recovered artifacts, 1900. Dawn broke in thin, gray light over the Veldt plains. Scouts dispatched at first light reported back with astonishment. The armored train, the one presumed lost in the fog and artillery, was found miles beyond enemy lines. Its wheels rested quietly on undisturbed rails, steam vents still faintly hissing, and the carriages intact, save for minor mud splatter and scraped paint from overgrown embankments. The wounded, huddled in blankets, were unharmed, their breathing shallow but steady, while the crew was nowhere to be found. Lieutenant Elias Mercer was absent. No trace indicated how he had traversed the final miles. A single item remained, his logbook, discovered wedged beneath the engineer's seat. The pages were meticulous, filled with schematics of greased pistons, rubberized bearings, padded undercarriages, and other modifications designed to reduce mechanical noise. Graphite sketches depicted every axle, every coupling rod, every seam wrapped in canvas. His handwriting was precise, analytical, almost clinical, a map of silence in motion. Command officers arrived quickly, their boots crunching over frost-slick rails. Initial reports were cautious, formal, and strictly bureaucratic. Inspection teams measured wheel alignment, examined bearings, and verified the integrity of steam systems, documenting each finding in official logs stamped confidential. The train's survival challenged conventional expectation. It had moved through artillery zones and patrol routes with no detection. Despite the evidence, higher command moved swiftly to suppress the details. The logbook was classified under the heading Experimental Noise Abatement, Do Not Distribute. Reports sent to headquarters omitted Mercer's name, reduced him to a faceless engineer, and described the operation as a routine convoy with anomalous results. Field officers noted his absence, but were instructed to record the missing engineer as unaccounted for during mission. Investigators noted, with unease, that a final page of the logbook was missing. It had once contained the schematic of this silent track modifications in full, the culmination of Mercer's experiments. The page had been torn neatly, as if intentionally removed, leaving only partial diagrams and annotations. No one could account for its removal. Some speculated it had been lost during the night run. Others whispered that Mercer himself had taken it as a personal record. The train remained under guarded supervision for days. Engineers cataloged each component, attempting to reverse engineer the modifications, but without Mercer's final notes, the experiment could not be replicated. The train, once a symbol of mechanical ingenuity, became a footnote in the war's record, cited briefly as an efficient armored convoy with unremarkable operational detail. By mid-morning, the wounded were evacuated to field hospitals, and the train was returned to standard service. Mercer's absence became a silent question mark in official files. No testimony survived that could confirm his fate. No other engineer possessed the knowledge to repeat his work. The missing log page became a small mystery, noted only in marginalia and hushed conversations among senior officers. Years later, when archives were reorganized and wartime relics cataloged, the torn page reemerged unexpectedly in a museum drawer. Its edges frayed, graphite lines faint but legible. It carried the blueprint of the silent locomotive, a single, haunting testament to a man who had disappeared into the fog he had mastered. Even within bureaucratic suppression, the final fragment survived, a quiet reminder of ingenuity, courage, and the invisible engineer who had turned sound itself into a weapon. Filed under. Armored Train Report, Post-Operation Analysis. Status, complete. Engineer, unidentified. Logbook recovered, missing page noted. Experimental mechanisms classified. Decades had passed since the war fronts of 1899 to 1900, yet the faint echoes of one engineer's innovation persisted, scattered among brittle papers, faded photographs, and half-forgotten testimonies. Lieutenant Elias Mercer, once an unassuming field engineer, had vanished into the mists of history. leaving behind only traces of his ingenuity, the silent track. In dusty archives, researchers sifted through bound ledgers and mechanical schematics. One photograph, sepia-toned and slightly torn at the edges, showed a locomotive with peculiar padding along its wheels, canvas wraps over pistons, and reinforced couplings. Notations in meticulous script accompanied the image, detailing methods to reduce friction and muffle the hissing of steam. Forensic historians speculated on their meaning, hypothesizing a prototype for quieted transport, a precursor to the stealth concepts later applied to armored vehicles and early 20th century tanks. Reports of soundless convoys surfaced in field journals and officer diaries. Some dismissed them as wartime myth, exaggerations born from foggy nights and frightened soldiers. Others, citing recovered notes and partial logbooks, argued that Mercer's experiments had real tactical impact. These soundless operations, if real, had allowed vital supplies and wounded personnel to traverse contested territories undetected, altering the rhythm of battle in ways never fully recorded. Film reels of post-war engineering demonstrations, projected in darkened rooms, revealed armored locomotives and early tracked vehicles, their undercarriages padded or rubberized, eerily reminiscent of Mercer's silent track modifications. Scholars debated whether the designs were conscious homage or coincidence. Some suggested that the principles observed in Mercer's notes had informed European tank engineers experimenting with reduced vibration and stealthy movement decades later. Yet ambiguity persisted. The torn page from Mercer's logbook, missing for years, had resurfaced in a museum drawer, but it offered only partial instructions, cryptic and incomplete. No definitive blueprint existed. No living engineer could replicate the system entirely. The story of the silent locomotive became half legend, half recorded history, a narrative suspended between fact and myth. The photographs, yellowed and curling, depicted empty rails stretching into the distance, fog rolling over steel and timber, and the faint outline of a train vanishing into the dawn. Across them, archival annotations noted experimental, unverified, and classified. Footnotes in military engineering journals referenced silent transport techniques, acknowledging their possible influence but never confirming operational details. The reader was left with questions. Did the silent track truly exist in functional form, or was it the product of one man's obsessive experimentation and wartime rumor? For historians, Mercer's tale became emblematic of war's hidden ingenuity, the inventions that alter conflict but remain invisible, credited to no one, celebrated by none. The silence he engineered was not merely mechanical, it was historical. It echoed in the quiet between archival pages, in the space between verified reports and whispered accounts, and in the lineage of armored warfare that followed. Ultimately, the story ended not with certainty, but with reflection. A forgotten invention, a nameless engineer, a silence that changed the sound of war. Filed under Historical Investigation, Silent Track Project. Engineer, Elias Mercer, unverified. Photographic evidence, partial. Operational confirmation, inconclusive. Influence on armored vehicle design, probable, unconfirmed.